Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our second webinar in the cybersecurity series. I'm Brittany Weldy with the Missouri Small Business Development Center. We have a guest today, our facilitator, Prasad Kalyam. He's a professor at the University of Missouri in all sorts of things, but a center director in computer science and electrical engineering. And I'll let you share more, Prasad, and then take it away.
All right, thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all back for the second webinar. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. So this is the second webinar in the series of defending small business cyber assets. So we've been working with SBDC and a really great group of experts to bring you this content on how small businesses can be more prepared in today's world of cybersecurity, right? Where the cyber attacks are getting more and more, complex, and you only have so much budget to deal with in the IT side to be prepared. So, what are some of the best ways we can, have a plan? So that's the thing we want to start with, and then how do we really then create a design of your security so you are adequately prepared, right? So in that sense, the first webinar talked about just knowing your business security position. So where do you stand? Where are your gaps? Where do you have some best practices already in place? And what are the best practices that are commonly followed? So the awareness of those aspects and creating a beginning of a plan was part of the first webinar. And in this second webinar, we're going to go a little bit more deeper. So we're going to start asking you to think about, you have a plan. Let's start talking about what are your requirements and how are you going to take those requirements and come up with an implementation, and how is that implementation going to fit with the design of your security so that you feel you're able to be prepared, right? In the cybersecurity sense of your business. So I have today with me this privilege. I have to introduce Jason Rinker from Stronghold Data. He's been such a great pillar of support, and he's going to add another track of expert advice and discussion that's going to be very, very valuable, because he is really in the middle of helping small businesses secure their assets. And also, I'm expecting Angie Robinson from the Missouri Homeland Security Office to also join us to also add to the discussion. And I have two wonderful teaching assistants who helped me put together this webinar, and we'll have a live demonstration today of what sort of a real application could look like in terms of a security design. So that will be with help of Dr. Sangji Wang and Roshan Nepune, who are at the Mizzou Center for Cyber Infrastructure Education Research. So with that, let's get started. It's nice to see who have joined, and we're really thrilled that you're able to spend this afternoon with us, and we're hoping to have a good discussion today. And if you've attended the last webinar, you can recall that we talked about, as I said, understanding your business security position, just knowing, where you are in terms of preparedness, what are the gaps, and how to think about your gaps, and then how to start thinking about a plan so that you could, keep yourself, prepared for any cybersecurity incidents. So in this webinar today, which is webinar 2, we're going to talk about deciding your security design principles, right? And what do I mean by that? I'll talk to you about it in more depth, but coming up, just a advertisement for webinars 3, 4, 5. Each will build on the other, but each by itself can still stand alone. And in the next one, we'll go more in terms of incident response, intrusion detection systems, where you're automating the process of dealing with cybersecurity incidents. In webinar 4, we're going to talk about having strategies that are active and passive, so you can really be on top of the way you monitor and defend your assets. And webinar 5 will be how to keep that security position in a way that's robust on an ongoing basis, and how do you do risk assessments on an ongoing basis. And so we're going to help you really create a comprehensive strategy by the end of webinar 5 for your small business. So here we go for webinar 2. We're going to do the same thing we did last time, which is we're going to start with a sequence of things that will get you engaged into what we're going to talk today. And then there will be some conceptual things that I will go through, give you some interesting pointers to state-of-the-art information that's valuable in your thinking. And then we'll actually do a little bit of a discussion with a group discussion to deepen our thinking about these salient points that we're going to discuss today. And we'll have a little bit more talk before we go into an exercise, which will be a fun exercise to really take away the key messages from this. And then we'll close strong, right? We'll have a kind of a main summary of what today was about that you can carry forward. So this is the plan. It's going to be, as I said, engaging, interactive. We'll have some group discussions, and feel free to jump in with your questions. Unmute your microphone or put in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. So let's start with engage. So the details of what we want to do today is I'm going to start with telling you, cybersecurity is something which is kind of a dilemma in the sense that you need it, but you don't need it a lot. But again, as much you put cybersecurity in, it's not enough. So that's the dilemma there, right? So you can argue for or against cybersecurity very easily. So we'll start, putting that perspective first before we go off and saying, okay, what do we need in terms of security, right? So how much security we want to buy, or how much security we want to enforce in our enterprise, right? In the business. And then we'll think about how do we then take a lot of requirements, which are both technical as well as business oriented requirements for security, and then customize it to what you need to do in your small business. So we want you to be productive, right? But we want you to not overwhelm yourself with security and have a cost that you cannot probably bear, right? So what's this sort of risk tolerance that you would love to have as you operate your business, where there are issues, but then you're willing to tolerate that risk, and you have at least a strategy in place to deal with if there was a risk that you didn't cover properly, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about those things, and then the exciting part of the last part of this talk will be, we'll actually show you a real world demonstration of an application and how to think about, what are the security design requirements, what are the design principles, and how does it look like, right? If you say an application is secure. So we'll show you like a live example at the end. So to get a sense of who you are and what your experience is, Brittany will help me now launch an online Zoom poll. It's a very simple poll, yes or no questions for a minute. And please answer the poll so that we can kind of know who you are and your experiences.
You'll have about a minute to answer questions, so chime in when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you for giving your inputs. We're almost there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we got full responses. Yeah, please show the results of the poll if you can.
Yeah.
There you go. That's awesome. So I'm so happy to know everybody is familiar with ransomware attacks. That's a good thing. And I know it's going to be a long list, but at least some of you have a sense of what are the cyber threats that impact your business. And I would say most of us probably don't know all of it, but at least we try to figure out a few that we know are going to be obvious and important to deal with. And last time we talked a lot about monitoring as a very essential part. So, very basic thing, if you have a home, you want home insurance, they're going to ask you, hey, do you have a monitoring system? Right? It's going to add an extra layer that gives the insurance company the confidence to reimburse, right, issues. So the monitoring is going to be key. So in the sense, if you have cybersecurity insurance, let's say there is a case, if you don't have monitoring, it's harder to make a case that something is wrong today and it was okay yesterday, right? Or really have a sense of, here is evidence that this is wrong and I need compensation. So monitoring is going to be critical to not only act internally, but also for compliance, for any legal issues that you need to deal with because of the cybersecurity incident. So I'm glad that some of you are thinking about monitoring and having an ongoing investment to look at cybersecurity in your business. And obviously you all have roadblocks. And some people might feel there is no roadblock like here we're seeing. So let's discuss that. So, so Jason, what do you think about the responses and what's your experience in terms of, this sort of questions we're asking?
Well, I agree with you, Prasad. It was exciting to see that everyone has heard of ransomware. I mean, it's probably hard not to these days since it's so prevalent. The one that, I really, stuck out to me was the roadblocks, and really trying to understand what it would take to implement, proper security layers throughout an organization, along with, the monitoring and detecting those cyber attacks. So I think those kind of go hand in hand, is making sure that you have the education of what tools are available to help you defend and detect. But if there was time, I would always like to dig more into like the roadblock side of things to truly understand, because some people find, through sharing of information through forums like this, we can all share information that someone may not be aware of, or someone could share something with us that we're not aware of. So just talking about it is great.
Yeah, and the roadblocks are going to be a very interesting point. We can have a group discussion on it. And as I said, it's money, it's technology, expertise in the IT side of things to implement security design, and also, as I said, this legal issues. So yeah, there's going to be things that we'll have to consider, and maybe everybody doesn't have the same issues, right? So it's going to be custom issues. So we'll get to that point in the talk. So thank you for participating in that. Thank you so much. And so let's go to the next part of our session, where I'll present a few things that personally I have been able to realize are critical concepts when you think about security design. So I have worked in cybersecurity for over 20 years with many industry. I do research, which is federally funded with industry also. And we solve all kinds of security design issues that range from sort of small business, small applications to large scale cloud systems. So we've sort of seen this whole spectrum. But one thing is true, is some of the fundamentals are going to be the same. So in this set of slides that I've shared, I'm going to walk you through some of the fundamentals I think are going to be critical to get your understanding about, how do we come up with a security design that meets the requirements of security, right? And again, it's going to come with a set of dilemmas. You're going to have to deal with, some, orthogonal things like I'll talk about, which hopefully, if you can come to an agreement within your organization of what is going to be a priority, you can then use that in your design. So the cybersecurity design starts with coming up with some sense of a list of requirements in your business. So you have different applications, you have different data, right? You have maybe some hardware assets that are networked that need to be protected, right? So you're going to have to start a checklist of, what are the things that are critical, and how do you want to go about, making sure they are secure, and what are the threats that really are going to be, important to consider as you, create your security mechanisms. And so, the greater the impact of the threats, you want to think about the more elaborate mechanisms, right? So, so start with a set of requirements, right? That's obviously the first thing, and realize that in developing a security mechanism, the potential of an attack on a business is really, always going to be, 100%, right? Any part of your system can be attacked, right? So you will be attacked, right? And we talked about it last time. There are, small businesses that have been attacked, will be attacked soon, or eventually will be attacked, right? So, so just like a termite protection salesman, right? Cybersecurity salesman we talked about last time also could come with, these sort of scary stories overselling security, but at the end of the day, it's up to us to figure out, what's important, and always know that you don't expect some things to happen when a cybersecurity incident happens. And so there's always this surprise effect in an attack, which is hard to really compensate for or know in advance and be prepared. So it's going to be difficult to have 100% security, but starting with some sense of idea that these are important things to protect, and then these threats might be becoming real, and also knowing that you might not know all of the threats and have preparation for all of it, right? And we want to say security is not just cybersecurity in the virtual sense, but also cybersecurity in the physical sense. So if you have data centers or your machines running critical applications, you should be worried about physical security. If you have laptops or devices that have your business assets, you should be very critical about the physical security of those devices, right? So not only you need to think about virtual machines or computers, but you also need to think about where they are and physically are they secure. And this is the problem that we can think about all of the things we want to address in terms of weakness, but if there's even one weakness the attacker is going to exploit, then you're going to have a serious attack, right? So we're trying to be as prepared, but the attackers just need to find one single weakness. Yes, Jason, please go ahead.
To that, Prasad, you make a great point about they only have to be right one time. They can find a single weakness, whether that's in the physical, like you're talking about, it could be on the human side. We worked with a business that after the fact that they were breached, doing the forensics, you found that they came in through a server is an RDP session that was connected to the internet that they had forgot about, that was set up just for security cameras on a remote location that had no workstations at it. And so it's that weak link, and they only have to find one to start elevating themselves up through the network. So I think that's a great point that you make there, Prasad.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. And in the group discussion, we'll go into more of these weak points, and I'll talk about security by a shoestring, right? So you can have lots of chains, but it's this one part of the chain, which is a shoestring, that's really what the attackers will eventually find and try to exploit, right? And then the other challenge in cybersecurity is, good example is passwords. So, when we rely on cybersecurity as some kind of a secret information that we possess to, enforce cybersecurity, there's going to be challenges in creation, distribution, and protection of the secret information. So reliance on one particular mechanism that could be compromised, would compromise your whole security, right? And passwords is a good example, but we can talk about it in any other context where the mechanism you're trying to use to protect has to be also in some way secure. So with those in mind, what are we dealing with in terms of dilemma, right? So we understand these are the security challenges we need to deal with in terms of finding the requirements and knowing that the weaknesses can be exploited, and even the security mechanism in some sense has to have some way that does not break the whole implementation, correct? So the challenges lead to a sort of interesting sort of dilemmas, is that we are never going to be prepared for the scale and complexity of cyberspace, which is constantly changing. There are new applications, new technologies, new societal norms. And so how are we going to be prepared? That's really a dilemma, because it's hard to catch a moving target, right? So it is sort of hard to really be all caught up. And the other thing is the nature of the threat, and we talked about it last time. So the attackers are not just people who are somebody in the basement kind of an issue, right? We're talking state-sponsored attackers, very motivated attackers with very professional skills and access to customer services to launch attacks, right? So that they are able to be really very effective. And so we're talking about a very sophisticated adversary here. And so the nature of the threat is also overwhelming. And you might say, do you really want to go after them, or do you scale back? So it's another dilemma of how far you want to go and engage your adversary. And so Jason has put some good point here. 42% of companies are breached by a bad password. And I don't know if you've seen me, but at least there have been 4 times I've been on ABC News and so on in the local news talking about incidents with Yahoo passwords being broken, and the mother of all password managers being broken. So there's a password is a really bad way to secure a cyber system, but we've learned to deal with it, live with it, and we still have challenges with it. And then Brittany also saying how a simple change can protect us more. That's great. Thanks, Brittany. So the nature of the threat is also going to be a dilemma for us. So how do we really, face this adversary, right? Who's going to be very, very sophisticated, and we might not have the resources, expertise, or the will to really go after. So, but you still need a preparation, right? So how do we deal with that? That's a dilemma. And then user needs versus security implementation. And if you're a designer of security, or you're considering making investments in your business for security, there is a lot you could do, right? And the more security you start implementing, it gets harder for your users to do their actual jobs, right? If I need to log into 2 servers to get to my actual work machine, or you have them access files through manual approvals of things, so you want to make sure people are authorized to view in a certain way. So whatever mechanisms you're able to put, and obviously the most important security mechanism we will put is human in the loop. So we will put somebody who is authorized to agree that it's okay, or who's authorized to monitor that it's okay to do, and all that, right? So the more you start adding these security implementation loopholes, and more people you involve in the chain to implement your security, obviously it's going to make the users less productive, and they're going to be inconvenienced, and they will find ways to go around your security. And that's the story of many attacks, is people, especially in healthcare and finance, organizations that put overwhelming security. There have been many cases where people in the organization have tried to sort of just get around those because they think it's too burdensome, and that has really led to big major incidents. So know that the users don't want to be inconvenienced, right, with your security. So it's good to have that sense in the dilemma. And last but not least, we talked in the previous webinar that security is more like fat, right? Is it sugar or fat? That was the question. So sugar is after a certain amount of sweet, right? You just say that's too much, it's enough, right? You can't feel anymore. But the more fat you put, it tastes yummy, right? Triple cheesecake and all that. So security is more like that. The more you put it, feels better. And really, at the end of the day, if you have a big defense budget, you can obviously overwhelm the attacker's attack budget. You will always win, right? There's a temptation to put too much investment in security, but again, there's no way to know when to stop, right? And it's very difficult to also know if you've invested certain amount of money for cybersecurity, is that giving a return on investment? It's been hard to really know that. So Jason, do you have a comment on that?
To that end, Prasad, it comes down to risk management. Like you were saying, when it comes to spending, you really have to understand your risk as an organization, because you can throw good money at solutions that really, do not have the return on an investment. So the first step is always understanding your risk. And then once you have that, you can determine how much to spend in what areas. Also, you look at risk is how much does an organization want to take on themselves? How much do they want to offload to an insurance, like you were talking about? You can also offload risk to third-party vendors and diversify that for an organization.
Yeah, great. And then Daniel, it's a good question. How do we assess risk? And there's an official way to do it, but the more easier qualitative answer is, at what point do you say that I know that this is going to happen, but I'm okay with it, right? So if I'm a home security solution person, I might say, hey, obviously put your sensors and secure your doors. And somebody might say, well, do you want to secure your windows also? And you might go like, I'm fine with doors. Okay. Yeah, I know windows can also be broken, but I don't want to pay this extra, $50 to put sensors on my windows, for example. So, so in some sense, there is a way you can basically say, I understand that that's a problem, which is first thing is important to know that that's a problem, right? It's going to be a problem. And then second, saying like, I can live with that. I don't think I really want to go beyond it. And in the more formal quantitative sense, we look at basically what are the threats and what's the likelihood of that threat becoming an attack, right? And so we want to basically have a risk tolerance that shows that, if in fact there is an attack and there is a very good likelihood of an attack, are we prepared for that, right? So that's another way to have a quantitative risk score. And it's a standard actually used by all enterprises, and the federal NIST organization has a guideline. And in fact, we'll do a very comprehensive NIST risk assessment in the webinar that follows. But for now, you can just think like what Jason was saying, knowing how much you want to be engaged in the cybersecurity strategy, so that you feel comfortable that you got coverage for what you think are really going to be critical. And obviously you can go far, but you might say, I'm not going to do that right now.
And Prasad, to add to that, is something that came from the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have a tool that people can leverage to assess risk, and it's basically a formula, and I think it fits what you were saying, is when an organization, they have to take their threats, what is the likelihood that something is going to impact their organization? You times that by the vulnerability, and that's the likelihood or the characteristic of something happening within your network that is susceptible to that hazard. And then you times that by the consequence, and what's the negative effect of, your organization's image, the confidence in your organization, financial impact, whether you're a government entity or not. So when you do operational risk as threats times vulnerabilities times consequences, you can start evaluating what mitigation controls go into place. And usually for organization, that starts at the top with the leadership and the leadership team coming together and trying to really list out what are the top 10 things that in the event of a natural disaster, in the event of a cyber event like we're talking about today, what systems have to come up first for our organization. One of the stories I like sharing when it comes to risk, and this also feeds into disaster recovery and planning, is in May of 2011, the Joplin tornado that came through and destroyed about a third of the town. It also moved a 7-story building inches, and that building was a hospital. And I know that that hospital had a disaster recovery plan, and they always said that if we were hit with a tornado and our building was, pretty much destroyed, we wouldn't need IT. Well, unfortunately, that disaster recovery plan was not accurate, and that was that after the tornado hit, they had tent hospitals set up within hours and were treating patients, and they needed access to technology. So doing tabletop discussions like we talked about in the first webinar series that Prasad led would help in the conversation of a risk assessment. But again, threats times vulnerabilities times consequences is a great place to start.
That's great. And yes, there are spreadsheets, and we'll actually go through them. We'll go actually, when we get to the point of the webinars, we'll do a simple spreadsheet and we'll do a more, realistic spreadsheet, which requires some extra thinking, like we talked about, the consequences, likelihood, impact. So to quantify some of the risk, you need some guidance. So we'll get to that point. But thank you, Jason. Appreciate it. And thank you, Daniel, for the great question. So let's get into the next part. So knowing the challenges, knowing that, these are going to be some of the dilemmas, right? How do we start really becoming realistic in terms of the security requirements, correct? So in cybersecurity, we call this as IT security management because it's a set of things we do that really, at the end of the day, help us manage, because as I said, there are things we cannot really completely overcome. So we need to really know how far we can go and manage the threats that we think are definitely worth addressing. So the process seems straightforward, right? To have a clear view, to really come up with a security plan which has certain objectives, some policies, and some, like we're just talking about with Jason, a general risk profile that you are happy with, right, for your business. So you do these 3 set of questions, right? So what assets need to be protected? How are those assets going to be threatened? And what can you do to be, prepared to counter those threats, right? So most people think it's these 3 things, but the actual truth is, if you think this is the answer, it's wrong. And you might say, well, it makes complete sense. What is wrong here? What else would I do? And the actual answer is yes, but also it's iterative. So you cannot just do it once or do it in a linear fashion and say I'm done. So it's pretty much an ongoing iterative process. So you'd have to kind of figure out what assets need to be protected, know those threats, and again you go back and really look back at those assets and go like, are these really the assets to be protected, right? And then you can go further and say what could be done to counter those threats, and then you might go back and say, how are those assets actually again threatened, and maybe you'll go back and change in that sense what assets need to be protected. So it's going to be a little bit of an iterative process, and it's kind of the hard work that goes in to really come up with a good strategy, right? So it is definitely a formal process also for answering these questions. As I said, you can have a qualitative answer, you can have a quantitative answer, and to whatever extent you want to go, there are tools, mechanisms, and procedures that you can use. And at the basic level, you can come up with a plan, but you need to maintain that plan over time, right? So in this iterative process that I talked about, you need to really, again, have a very critical monitoring and also monitoring of the security controls you've put in place, because if your systems are changing, the controls might not work as expected, right? So an example is, you might say, I'm going to be protecting this port on this application server, and maybe sometimes you have the application move, to another location, or an application is relying on another application through a different port, and that might be an opportunity for somebody to attack your application, right? You might have been protecting one port, but this other port that your application is accessing might be an entry point. So knowing basically that your controls are in place to protect what you need to protect, and also that your controls are not going to be affected as the system changes, right? And obviously, we're going to have to keep up with the new threats and vulnerabilities. So as I said, the technology is a moving target. The skill of the attackers who will be after you will be a moving target. The users who are using your systems and how much security they can bear is going to be a moving target. And how much you're going to keep spending on security to make your business secure is also going to be a moving target. So it's going to be hard to really hold on to one set of principle and just forget about it, right? So it has to be ongoing and maintained and monitored to be effective. And so we talked about this concept of really what are those threats, right? How do we start making a inventory of our assets and the kind of threats that will be, potentially, realized in case of an attack that affects our business, and how do we really come up with countermeasures for those things, right? So we want to think about all of these things in this CIA triad, we call it. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And obviously there's accountability, authenticity that are also important, but the CIA triad is going to be the most critical thing that we think about in terms of protecting data, assets, and service that are running in web systems, and even hardware assets that are networked, right? So we want to look at these CIA issues, and we talked about what are they, right? In terms of our actual applications, we want to think about loss of confidentiality as a threat, loss of integrity as a threat, loss of availability as a threat. And if you can put all your threats under one of these three buckets, that's the way you can get a hold around what the types of threats you need to deal with, right? So the list, like we talked about in the beginning in the open questionnaire, if you're able to come up with a list and then put them under these three buckets, that's the most effective way. And if you have a bucket that's completely empty, then you've not done a good job, right? You've missed something out completely. In confidentiality, we're trying to preserve, authorized restrictions on information access and disclosure to protect, personal privacy and proprietary information. In integrity attacks, we are, making sure we don't have people modifying, destroying information that we think is supposed to be sacred, right? Or is going to be critical for your business. And in availability is making sure you have timely and reliable access to the services or data that you're going to be using to operate your business. And the chance of an attack is real, but we also want to be sensitive to the fact that not all attacks have equal impact, right? So some attacks have a higher impact that could completely disrupt your business, and like Jason said, it could really have a hit on your reputation, and it could have very long-term consequences. So you need to understand those. And then there are the lower ones, which are minor. There might be some financial loss, issues, but they're not as severe, right, in terms of disruption. And then obviously there are moderate ones. So you can kind of get your head around, what are those threats, and are they low, are they moderate, are they going to be high if in fact they are realized by an attacker. And different things can happen, right? So the way, as I said, to make a list is to say, what are the attacks that cause loss of availability? What are the attacks that could cause loss of confidentiality? And what are the attacks that cause loss of integrity? And so we are looking at hardware, software, data, communication lines, all these things that are assets in the business. And we're going to try to make a list of these threats, correct? So if in fact you have a hardware attack, equipment being stolen, or if it's an integrity attack, like we had with Sony, where they altered the infrastructure, which is a very difficult thing. So literally they had to replace their entire infrastructure because of that attack. Or in confidentiality, where somebody just compromises your online drive, right? And here there are other attacks for software where programs are deleted, or there's unauthorized copying of software, or a working software is modified so that they can plant these malware, right? So we have seen this in the SolarWinds attack we talked last time, which is in the news a lot. The US government is really scrambling to clean up the mess of that attack, right? And then in terms of data, which is going to be very critical, making sure you're able to access your data that your business needs to operate. And obviously, copying data is going to be a really problematic thing in terms of intellectual property and all of that. And obviously, people modifying your data without your consent is also going to be a threat. And networking, we don't have to say this, right? So we talked about last time in terms of active and passive attacks where there's spoofing and sniffing, right? So people can intercept your communications, modify them, replay them, right? So all of these are, again, challenges you need to be prepared when you start listing the threats. And in terms of putting down your requirements by saying, okay, these are the threats, and then here are what I would like to do in terms of coming up with a sense of countermeasures. You can have access controls, you can have awareness training, you can have incident response, you can do risk assessments, you can have, contingency planning. The list is very long. Actually, there's like 16 or 18 things you can be doing. But my point is not to overwhelm you with all of those details, but to give you a sense that the preparation could be pretty extensive depending upon your security requirements. So again, as we said, it's a formal and iterative process. You could start small, right? Nail it, right? Really protect your most critical assets, and then you can scale it. And then you can, keep adding more controls and layers. And again, as you're adding more and more security, we have the dilemmas, right? So you need to make sure it doesn't affect the user productivity. And again, it is giving you some sense of the return of investment, even though you can't measure it, that it's going to look like a sound investment for your business. So the strategy then, right, is at the end of the day, in some way to put all these requirements in place and then come up with obviously some kind of a policy, right, that is a formal statement of rules and practices that specify how your organization will handle the security services to protect the critical resources. And then how are you going to implement the security, right, in terms of prevention? And we talked about this last time, prevention is better than cure. So the more proactive you are, the better, right? So, but again, how much are we going to invest in the implementation of being proactive versus having the ability to detect incident as they happen and having a more reactive response and recovery also, right? And at the end of the day, you need to have some sort of an assurance that is grounds for having confidence that your system is operating and your policy is being enforced. And last but not least, this iterative process needs a continuous evaluation of knowing at every point in time that what you're protecting and what you're adding as a security mechanism, they are all working as you expect, right? And they're meeting certain criteria that you set forth when you did that investment in security. So the another way, which is more formal, more like a conceptual way to think about the implementation is, we talked about this last time also, is to know your attack surfaces. Or from an attacker perspective, knowing their attack vectors, right? So what are the ways in my network or software or even the human side, right? We talked about social engineering last time. So people being coerced to give away passwords or critical information of an enterprise without the person knowing that they're being tricked, right? So there's issues that you need to know that really are going to be these attack surfaces. From all of these perspectives, like I said, ports or people who are vulnerable to social engineering, or your web assets that are software systems in the cloud or on your data center virtual machines, right? And the way more formally you can take those attack surfaces and create sort of this list of threats is to create what we call as attack trees. And this is pretty much what people do in physical security also. So here we're showing you how you can rob a casino. That's the goal of the attacker, right? And if you've seen all the Ocean's 10, Ocean's 11 movies, you kind of have a sense of what we're talking here, right? Just like you can think of this sort of physical security, you can think of what's the goal of the attacker at the end of the day, right? If your business is going to be targeted, right, what's going to be the goal? And what's going to be the threat that, if it is real, is going to really impact your business, right? So you can basically make this sort of an attack tree that has a goal of the attacker. What would be their objectives in that sense when they launch the attack? And then what are the methods they will use to do the attack? And what are the intermediate steps they will do? And really, what do they really finally achieve in terms of attacking your assets, correct? So here, as you think, you can see you're thinking like the attacker, right? You're kind of going through a worst case scenario for what could go wrong, right? And this really informs you, right? And this gives you a really serious understanding of, not just having a long list of threats, but really knowing what is their impact and really what's the way that threat could be realized. Like we said, ultimately the risk profile for your business is going to depend upon your understanding of what are your threats and also the likelihood of the threat becoming real. And like Jason said, multiply that with your consequence, right? You really have your risk at the end of the day. And so this is really a more formal way of putting down how the threats could be having a consequence. And in formal way, we call this as threat modeling. So it's a way to know how there are internal and external vulnerabilities in your system. And the threat model ultimately tells you what countermeasure is ideally suited for defending against this attack. And this is a very industry standard way to do it, where we define the threat. We, like I said, diagram it using the attack trees, right? Identify mechanisms in which we need to deal with the attack, find a way to mitigate the attack, validate that the mitigation is actually working. And then you do this iteratively for different attacks, or even for the same attack on an ongoing basis, considering all the dilemmas. The technologies are changing, the systems will change, people will change, your investment will change, and the nature of the attacks will change, right? And so this is the last slide in terms of the concepts. One of the common ones is from Microsoft. It's called the STRIDE threat model. And I'll give you an example when we go to the case study of how to implement this, but this is a very popular one that's used. There's another one just from MITRE, which is called ATT&CK. That's another very popular one used in small, medium, and large businesses. That's another tool you can use as a way to do your threat modeling. And at the end of the day, as I said, you want to categorize all your threats under the CIA triad, right? The confidentiality, integrity, availability triad. And you can put these STRIDE threats under those categories, right? So you can talk about spoofing. In STRIDE basically stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, right? And escalation of privilege or elevation of privilege. And I'll give you a real case study when we talk about the live demonstration. But this is a very popular way to really create a threat model to start beginning your implementation. So we've done a lot of talking. Now let's just get into a little bit of an interactive group discussion. And I'm happy that you're already asking questions and all of that. And so here is a question I would like you to think about, right? So like we asked in the beginning, what are the challenges? What are the roadblocks you have? What do you see as benefits and limitations that you have in your business, right, to really create this IT security management that we talked about in terms of identifying your assets, figuring out what threats are there, and figuring out the countermeasures, right? And so we had basically in the opening survey a mixed set of responses. So does anybody want to share your perspective on any of these? You can either put your comments in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask the question.
This is Brittany from the SBDC. One quick thought that I keep thinking about as I work with small businesses is their financial data, like they're brand new and they sign up for Shopify or they get Square and not even knowing, the consequences. So I think the initial what assets need to be protected. I'd love to, help them talk about this more on when they sign up for all of these softwares, these cloud-based softwares, what kind of things to look out for.
Mm-hmm. So Jason, what do you see as common challenges people have or barriers people have? Because you said that's really where you have found a lot of friction, right, in coming up with a plan.
Some of the hurdles that we see is, first, knowing how to do a risk assessment and then communicating that to a leadership. Some businesses, they may have an IT resource on staff and they struggle communicating that to that leadership level because the leadership level doesn't have the technical expertise to understand what they're trying to convey. So sometimes that hurdle is that communication internally of an organization, because again, like I think I shared this example on the first webinar, is that we dealt with the manufacturer, the owner of the manufacturer is looking at, I could spend this $100,000 on implementing refreshing my data center, rolling out some new security measures, or I could spend that same $100,000 and buy a new CNC machine and increase maybe some output for profits. Cybersecurity can't really, when they see it as a cost center, it's hard. So it starts there. The other hurdle I see is like you mentioned, is that you could have death by tools, right? You could have so many tools that now you don't even know if those tools are being effective because you don't have time to monitor those tools. So I keep coming back to do a risk assessment of your organization, see what's most important, protect those, as we say, the crown jewels first. And then the last thing is education. These webinars, if you could get your leadership to sit in on some of these conversations, maybe at your local level, whether you have like a chamber of commerce or something that has some ongoing conversations, but just try to get the word out to your employees at an organization, because they're your weakest link. It is the people that have an email address and that touch, a keyboard. So having some sort of education program for those employees would help tremendously.
That's great points. And like, that's why we said the requirements have to be managerial also. It's just not technical. And understanding how the business goals drive the security investment is going to be very critical. If that's not aligned, then it's a war that you're already failing inside your organization, trying to convince your managers we need security. Forget the war of the adversary from the outside, right? I think that's a great point, Jason, that you made. And absolutely, like we've talked in this webinar, death by tool, right? So knowing what's the right composition, what's the right design, is going to be important. And that's the next thing we'll actually talk about, right? The design principles, which is the main point of this talk, is how do we get our head around, what principles do we go forward with? In some sense, they're best practices, right? That we use to actually implement. So a quick way to summarize, this discussion so far is, as I said, the challenges are going to be that, we can't address everything. And really the reality is the attacker just needs to know one weakness, and security by a shoestring is a real situation in many places, and many tools provide many kinds of protections, but many applications have many shoestring type of interfaces that could be exploited, and really keeping on top of it is very difficult. And this is my favorite cartoon bottom picture, which is I don't know if you've seen these cartoons before, but if you have to log in, stare at the sun is not going to work for your users. So if you put too much inconvenience to the users in your business to implement your mechanisms, they're going to want to, either bypass you or they will protest, right? So be ready to be, asked by your users that this is too much security. This is really annoying. I can't do my job. I know you want to protect things, but hey, look here, I can't do my job. So that arises. So those are definitely limitations that we need to really be careful about. So as I said, I want to tell you what are the ways in which you can come up with your design principles, right? So the implementation, as I said, is going to be about the design principles and customizing those design principles for your business, right? So how do we do that? And again, we have a lot of guidance from National Security Agency, Department of Homeland Security, and other organizations like NIST that provide us some kind of a framework. And here is a subset of those. There's actually many of these things, but each of these represents actually a very serious set of implementation steps, but by themselves, each of these words represents a really important way to implement your security. So in fact, last webinar, we talked about layering, right, Jason? So you talked about layering. You want to recap your thoughts about layering?
Sure. The layering is an important concept when you think of security, because security is not, there's not a silver bullet that you do this one thing and you're going to be ultimately protected. It's that onion, right? You got to have layers, whether that starts at the patch management, multi-factor authentication, password guidelines, that user education that we talked about. But that's, security also is going to involve that conversation with the leadership team, because you may want to involve an insurance policy to help offset some of that risk. So there's not just one thing that we can say is going to protect you. You have to implement a variety of tools to secure your environment, and knowing your environment is going to help also determine what tools would make the biggest impact. The last thing I would add is that you're never going to be at a zero risk. No matter how much that we do, you're not going to be 100% protected. It's like the analogy Prasad's been using about a house. Yes, we can lock every window and door, but the criminal may just break the window, right? Do a brute force attack on your network. So we do the best we can, and use the layered approach goes a long ways in minimizing that risk exposure.
Right, and then thank you, Jason. That's perfect. And we also talked about a couple of others, like isolation is another thing we talked about last time. And again, very important is if there are assets that are going to be very important, you want to try to make them decoupled from other things that could be more likely attacked. So we talked about this example I gave. If I'm going to Japan, I don't need to take my Kohl's credit card to buy clothes, right? In Colombia, I can easily go and buy in Kohl's, but when I go to Japan, there's not going to be a Kohl's store there. The only thing that can happen if I take my Kohl's credit card there is somebody might steal it, I might lose it, and it could be abused, right? So it's good to not put yourself, to that attack surfaces that really you don't want to deal with when you don't have to deal with it. So we talked a lot about those at the end of last talk, and that's actually one of the other important security design principle is to think about how do I isolate things so that I can minimize the attack surface, right? So the smaller the attack surface I have, the easier it is for me to defend or implement security or really worry about the investment of security. And the other thing we talked again last time, and we briefly touched this time, is humans are actually a very important asset in your business, but they're also one of the unfortunately easy vulnerabilities that attackers exploit, right? For physical security and virtual security. So even though you love all your employees, it's important to not give people more privilege than they need, right? This is the law of least privilege, which is, give only people privilege as per need. Don't start off by giving everybody all the privileges. And that's usually a recipe for disaster, because that person might be good, but people are also an attack surface in a cybersecurity context. And if that part is weak, in fact, many attacks have shown that the human element has been the cause of the attack more often than not, right? From not patching or giving away passwords, or leaving things outside that were compromised, right? So you can think of any of these human acts that could really again be an issue. So Jason, you have something to say about the human side of cybersecurity?
Again, I've kind of said this a couple of times in this series here, is the human side, in my opinion, is one of your weakest links at any organization. And that's that training element that comes in, but social engineering is a big piece to this. And then the phishing campaign, we did a phishing campaign for a county, and after we ran this campaign, they had like 9 people out of over 100 phishing tests that clicked on a link within this email. And so I'm sitting there with the leadership, and I'm showing them the results of this phishing test, and said, hey, you had 9 people click on these links. And they're like, whoa, well, we thought that's probably pretty good because only 9 people did it. And I, had to kind of change that conversation, that it only takes one. It only takes one click to damage your organization. When we worked with a manufacturer, and they had somebody in HR that clicked on or opened up a resume, and within 14 seconds, they were attacked and had machines infected before we could actually get that under control. And I mean, it happened so fast, and it's just so easy. And that's why that, whether it's social engineering, like we saw with Twitter. I mean, they had a high school student social engineer and was able to take control of some Twitter accounts, to someone in your HR department, or just even, somebody that is called a watering hole attack. They're doing some browsing and they go across the site that is malicious. So that human element, again, needs to be addressed along with the physical element, and then the hardware element. And as you're saying there, Prasad.
Thank you, Jason. Very, very good points. Great examples of actual world, real world scenarios. Thank you. And so, a couple of others is fail-safe defaults. So again, access should be given based on permission rather than exclusion. And complete mediation is basically knowing whatever is happening, you have one place where all of it is being tracked. So there are no mechanisms to bypass access, right? Or using a cache, for example, you thought there's no information available, a cache probably has that information, then somebody exploits the cache, for example. So putting these best practices goes a long way. And again, layering is another one Jason said. And again, even these best practices are layered in some sense, right? So with that, let's really think about how to do this in a real world context. And I've just picked an application that we have been working in a research lab that's a realistic application. And it might get a little bit technical, but if you have questions, please let me know. But we want to kind of show you how we go about doing these things, right? So like in any business, bring my annotation tool here. So there's always going to be data sources that are going to be critical. And today, a lot of our businesses are data oriented, right? We're creating value out of the data that we own, or the data that we're able to create, right? And there are going to be applications that are going to be using. And so here is basically this, you can say, data pipeline orchestration, where basically we're taking data, transforming it to create value, right? And so there's going to be a data access and workflow process. So there will be people who will be touching this data, modifying this data, using this data, copying this data. And you can replace what I'm saying as data as anything else. Right? It could be a hardware asset. It could be, a person's expertise. You can replace any asset with it. But I'm using this data example here. And so you have an entitlement database that basically says who is authorized to do what, right? In terms of access to data or manipulation of the data, or copying of the data also, right? Or even deleting the data, for example. So replacing, call it CRUD, create, replace, update, delete, right? So if people are doing those CRUD actions and they're dealing with this data management, how are we going to think of this application as a way to secure it? And obviously we'll have many people who will be involved in making sure that this data processing that we're doing, right, to create value in our business is working as expected, is meeting the security requirements, and is in a way, protected, right, and has the risk profile that we're comfortable with, right? So all these other things, don't worry about the buzzwords here of what the services are, but ultimately know that you'll have different workspaces and you have some people who are operating some of this data infrastructure to make the business function, right? So if you're given this sort of an application, right? So how do we go about thinking about this whole STRIDE strategy, as I said, and how do we think about the security design principles? So let me clear this and go to the next slide. So here is a simple demonstration, right, of how we can think of it. So as I said, you want to think about the CIA triad, right? Loss of confidentiality, loss of integrity, and loss of availability. So if you think of confidentiality, you don't want undesired data access for data in rest or in motion. And we talked about it last time, where you're worried about data which is sitting at a certain location, and protecting that is going to be important. And we talked about communication channel attacks. So if data is moving from one place to another place, that's another place which can be an attack surface. So here we're concerned about unintended users having privileges that make them either do things you don't like, or that could lead to some sort of a code injection, like Jason was saying. You go to one website and then it could trigger some other actions of some malware being installed that affects your entire system, right? And the application here is called Odyssey, which is a healthcare application. And so the design principle is, as we talked about, having isolation and modularity, so that if things change, you can change them modularly, and you can have security applied in a modular fashion. So based on the modules in the application, you can have modular security. That's a way to make your security design more robust. And think of data integrity when you lose control of your data, right? When other people have access to it, they might copy, they might do things with the data and corrupt the data, or you might have issues with them, in some sense, denying access to your data, right? So in these cases, it's good to have complete mediation as a good best practice, where you have auditability of all the data actions that are occurring, and you have some sense of assurance on that auditability. You can say that all my data has not been tampered with, right? And again, having people have the least privilege is always good. If they don't need privileges, don't give it to them, right? And last but not least, but loss of availability is this really extreme case where we worry about losing the data completely, right? Through some temporary attacks like denial of service attacks, or it could be some other, as I said, delete actions that users can do maliciously that will, make you not have access to data anymore. And so fail-safe defaults are great ways to have secure design in place. And again, layering is another way where it makes it harder for a real attacker to get to the most important data, right? So you can add these layers to secure your data. So at this point, let's do a little bit of a demo. So I will play a video, which is prepared by my student. He'll kind of go through this exercise of how we do it. It's about 10 minutes, so we can kind of just watch it. Share screen, share sound.
Good afternoon, everyone. The demonstration of attack detection and defense methods that we've employed on our Odyssey healthcare pipeline server. Before we show an attack and the detection by the system, let's go over the architecture. We have Odyssey users accessing the application server to request some medical data. A network intrusion detection system is in place which monitors the Odyssey server and has some rules that will basically be executed when an attack is detected. These rules will trigger logging of attack information, which are saved into the system for further processing. Then a Lambda function will use that information to initiate a possible routing of attackers to a quarantine virtual machine. A quarantine virtual machine is a decoy server which mimics the Odyssey, but will only be used to keep attacker busy trying to access the medical data. The time bot, by doing so, is used to learn more on the attacker's behavior and better the NIDS's detection capabilities. I have the AWS already loaded into my browser. AWS is Amazon Web Services, a cloud platform where our system resides. There's two servers, the Odyssey server and the QVM server. And there is a load balancer, which will analyze our users' request to access the service, sends the information to the load balancer and the Lambda function, and the Lambda function will tell the load balancer whether or not to forward a user to the application server. And yes, in case of an attack, then the Lambda will tell the load balancer to move the attacker into the QVM. There is this Lambda function where the logic resides. It uses one of the data or information that was logged from the user or the attacker once it was detected, and it grabs the IP address and then places in the blacklisted IPs, which is then used by the index or the logic file, which will tell the load balancer to do the next step. I'm copying this load balancer which will allow us to see the healthcare application pipeline. So here is a simple data request form that our Odyssey stack serves. Let's first of all go about some of the information. This is basically the information on the patients, where a particular user is trying to find some information related to patients based on their gender, their different conditions, what kind of drugs they use, and so on and so forth. So let's quickly fill this up. As you see, there is a range of what users or what patient data to gather. The gender, let's put as female, patient, maybe backache. The drug could be anything. The time frame of patient could be, say, 1, 2, I guess 5. And the domain selection could be, let's say, drug, and we are looking to fetch about 5 records here. So now when I submit this, what happens is the system will load the information that the user was seeking. Since it was a regular user, it will provide information that is there in the database as it is. So I'm going to launch an attack. What you're seeing right now is two terminals right here. The left-hand side is the attacker terminal, where I will be using a command that is an attack tool called slow HTTP test, which basically is a denial of service attack initiator, which will hit a certain web service or an IP address with maximum around 1,000 connection requests over a second. And then depending on how long it is launched, it will eventually exhaust the resources, that is the HTTP request connections. And at the right hand side here is an IDS where the monitoring can happen. The IDS monitor, the SH is the monitoring script which I will execute, which will monitor the main server whether it's attacked or not. And then once it is attacked, what it will do is basically say that there's been an attack, and then there will be the next steps, that is logging the attack information and updating the AWS console. So let's quickly start monitoring here. I'm going to launch the attack. The monitoring script, which will basically check if there's the attack happening, and then here I will initiate the attack basically. So there's 1,000 connections being trying to get connected, and then at a certain level, look at this. So there is the attack. The service is no longer available, and then it took a few seconds to identify it, but once it has realized, then what it does is that it captures a certain IP address, and it looks like this is the IP address that the attack has happened. And it will update the file, and then it says that the attacker has been blacklisted. Now let's go to the Lambda function here to see the blacklisted IP. You can see the same IP address, and that is if I look into my IP tool, it should tell me that this is my IP address. Okay, so it is. And now again, so I have this browser open, I'll try to access this load balancer, and the system has identified me as an attacker. So there should be some changes happening. So let's open a new incognito window to clean up the cache memory. Now I'll quickly do this. I'll just say some information here, and then I'll just do insert some more details. And when I submit this, so since the attacker, since the attacker is trying to access, what it is doing is trying to say to the attacker, it cannot be generated, or it could also basically add some different or like invalid information, so that attacker has the wrong information than what they're intending, or keep it in the loop as much as the system can, because having them engaged in our system will buy us some more time to get information on them, and they could go back, try to recreate it, but they won't succeed in getting the information. So let's see what happens if there is a user who is trying to achieve the same thing. So I have an Ubuntu server here where I have set up a VPN to use a different IP address than my computer. So when I do my IP here, I should basically be able to see it's something else. Yeah, so that is different from our 65, beginning with 65. So I'm going to again clear out the cache memory. I'll open the load balancer here. So that this is the load balancer that we used earlier. So let's look at it, what it does. So when I go here, again, it's the same deal. We have the same information here. So here, description, the funding information. So yes, some information, and so if I submit, then the normal user can basically access it. So this concludes the demonstration on how attackers can be redirected while the users are still accessing the important information without loss of availability at their end. Thank you.
So that was a kind of a live demonstration of an application. Like I said, is a real application, and you can essentially see how a security design is put in place. In this case, an active defense is put in place, and we saw fail-safe defaults, layering, mediation of the access, all of it being implemented. So hopefully you enjoyed that. So we're to the last part of the talk. So let's kind of reflect on some key takeaways, right? So I have an exercise. We'll quickly kind of look at it for a couple of minutes. So this is meant to kind of give you a little bit more thinking about this process of security requirements and threat identification that we talked about. I'm going to put this in the chat for all of you to see, and I'll bring it up here also. So this exercise is, again, a simple exercise where you're thinking about your security requirements and you're thinking about your threats, and you're able to, in some sense, have a handle on what are the countermeasures you need. And as we talked about, maybe you want to really have the countermeasures for the ones that have high impact, right? And some might be medium and some might be low. And so you're free to look at it. So here's just a toy example. Think of an ATM machine, which is a simple exercise. Your actual business application may not be as simple as an ATM machine, but just trying to get a sense of the problem, right? If you have an ATM machine and you're interested in the CIA, right, triad threats, and you're trying to put up all your requirements, right? So just take a minute to look at each of these and put a check on which is high, which is low, which is medium. Obviously, some things look like they're all very important. They need to be a high. Some might look low, and some might be, like print a transaction ticket only if the customer requests. That might not essentially be a high thing, right? So you can see, you can come up with a set of things that could go wrong, right? Or things you could put in place that prevent as a countermeasure. And you can have some sense where the countermeasure is required or not, depending on what you think is this CIA threat, right? Is it low, medium, or high? And so this is kind of a nice example to see how you can think through these requirements and come up with a set of countermeasures you think are important to protect either your high, medium, or low consequence threats on your assets. Okay, so in 5 minutes, let's close strong. Let's go back to our discussion with Jason on some concluding remarks, right? So at the end of the day, we want to make sure I have the right. slide, yes. Yes, so let's make sure that the cost versus security, is one factor, right? But ultimately, the security policy is a business decision, right? It's influenced by usability, risk tolerance, legal requirements, and we can go all the way in building great firewalls, deep moats to make it harder to get to our assets, hire very, very smart people to defend ourselves. But the dilemmas like we talked about in the beginning, and also your design has to be well done so that ultimately your business is operational. And like Jason was saying, you can spend it on things you really need to grow your business. But again, you have to make sure you're protecting what you have to protect to keep being in business, right? So Jason, you have any concluding remarks?
I think that the point about it is a business decision, and you need to take into account a lot of different things. And to your point is, you can have too much to where it hampers, the production of if you're a manufacturer or a service industry where it impacts the delivery of those services. But when you approach it as a business decision, as a risk decision, you can't go wrong. And I think that some of the big takeaways from today's, especially in the example of that data hack, if you will, is, segregation. You need to really understand what, in Prasad's example of you don't need to take a certain credit card with you over to Japan. So that isolation, encrypting data at rest, encrypting data in motion is some other ones. But don't forget about a good disaster recovery plan when it comes to backing up that data. So that way you have that. And in a really simple process when it comes to backups is follow the 3-2-1 rule. You want 3 copies of your data in 2 different locations, and one of those at least offsite. So that's what I would add today. Great job, Prasad and team.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for your attention. We have a little bit time for a question or two if you have. If not, but I really appreciate you coming to this webinar, and hopefully it's been useful. Oh, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate you coming, and really thank you for all the great questions and interaction.
Yeah, this has been really educational for me as well, for me personally. This may be a big question in general. So we have the cloud-based servers, versus physical servers. And I know a lot of things have moved to cloud-based. So in essentially, is it more secure for cloud-based services?
That's a great question. And if you ask the cloud providers, they'll say yes. Give me your money. But in reality, the way to think about that is, the cloud has more controls you can implement because it's built with a lot of, we call them services for security, and there is a lot of tools you have readily available in the cloud. So if you really want to customize something, protect something, it's easier in the cloud to have the necessary tool and the right configuration to protect what you're looking for, versus if you're doing it by your own, outside the cloud, your toolkit is going to be limited. Your automation ability to deal, like some of the things that Roshan was showing, is possible because of the automation in the cloud, the elasticity of the cloud to scale if there are, a high level of attacks. So in that sense, the cloud is more secure. And there was a lot of debate on this, but right now there's no debate. Everybody agrees that the cloud is the way to go, and it is more expensive. Ultimately, it might cost you 4 times more than running your own operations of your machines, but ultimately it gives you definitely this ability to scale and customize at a level that you cannot do anywhere else. So Jason, what do you think?
I agree with you, Prasad. For us, it comes down to how it's set up. I mean, and you kind of indicated that is the cloud offers a lot of things that an on-premise solution doesn't, but vice versa. And so again, this is more one size does not fit all when you're trying to determine if you go cloud, or even we're seeing organizations doing a hybrid approach where they do certain applications in a cloud environment and certain applications on premise. So you have to look at the business case. Again, kind of goes back to what Prasad said. It's a business decision on what you do, but whenever you make that decision, what's going to be the best fit is really take a look at the options that the cloud has offered to help secure that data, to protect it, and then same way with an on-prem solution. So they get hacked just as easy. I mean, because you usually have passwords that secure your cloud environment as you have passwords that secure your on-premise, and that comes back to that human element that you got to train them no matter which way you go.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for that. That's, there's so many things to think about. It's so thoughtful. I'm very analytical, and so I have a bunch of questions, but we're out of time, and definitely can email you afterwards. But thank you everyone for coming today, and join us next week, same time, same place, and I'll send out the Zoom links to everyone. And these are being recorded, so I'll make sure you have access to previous recordings if you weren't able to watch them fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you. Thank you, Prasad.